Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation on Going Virtual, Pivoting to Remote Moderated Usability Testing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we're going to be talking about our experiences conducting remote usability testing for the first time. This won't be a step-by-step how-to for remote testing, but rather a comparison on what it was like to pivot to remote testing from the traditional in-person testing that we've done in the past. We'll talk about some of the technical and facilitation considerations, as well as key lessons learned and next steps for future usability testing. For those curious about more details around the how-tos, we'll also provide a resources folder at the end highlighting our testing materials and documentation. To get started, here's a bit of history for how usability testing looked at the UTSC library prior to the pandemic. We'd done several phases of traditional usability testing on our main library website between 2016 and 2019. During these sessions, users would come in person to a quiet testing space in the library and complete a series of tasks using the website. A facilitator would be present in the room to guide participants through the testing, and an observer was also present to take notes on any interesting behaviors and pain points. Once testing was complete, data from across the sessions was analyzed to identify key problems and create a strategy for addressing them. After making changes on the website, we'd then repeat the testing to A, see if improvements were made, and B, check for any additional usability problems. Fast forward to July 2021, when the library launched a new pilot website for the makerspace. Due to COVID and the ongoing lockdown, we hadn't had the opportunity to do any testing prior to launch. However, we still felt that it was important to get user input on the site to see if we could make any improvements. With this goal in mind, our 3-member team set up to conduct remote moderated usability testing for the first time in spring 2022. The good news was that overall structure of usability testing stayed the same. We determined who our target users were and what key tasks they perform on the website. We'd recruit students and carry out our testing, and then we'd perform data analysis to identify potential web changes. There were, however, 2 crucial areas where we'd need to rethink our approach: the recruitment process and conducting the actual testing. Recruitment and pre-screening wasn't terribly onerous. The main changes we experienced here were lack of recruitment signage and staff boosting the study via word of mouth at patron interaction points, such as the library entrance and the front desk, as well as the need to provide extra instructions and reminders to users about space and technology considerations that were required for participation in the testing. The actual testing itself, however, had many nuances to work out. We'll highlight some of our key considerations, starting with the technical piece to actually run the sessions, followed by the facilitation piece, with a focus on the nuances of cognitive burden and human dynamics.
On the technical side, one of the first things we had to decide was what platforms we were going to use to conduct and record the testing sessions, since users would no longer be coming into a physical room where a laptop would be pre-prepared. We opted to use Microsoft Teams to host the meetings as it was already supported by our institution and allowed for ease of coordination among our testing team. While Microsoft Teams does allow for recording, we opted to use a separate screencast software, Camtasia, to capture video and audio portions of the tests. This was done in case users experienced any issues with Teams the day of the testing, in which case we had Zoom at the ready to switch to as a backup. Thankfully, we never had any issues, but this was done as a precaution to make sure we could keep recordings running from start to finish across all sessions. Finally, there was the importance of a quiet testing space, combined with a stable internet connection for both users and the testing team. This is where we had the least amount of control compared to in-person testing, In the latter, we could confidently plan around wired connections and minimal disruptions. There was no way to enforce these with remote virtual testing, as it was really up to each individual to ensure proper technical arrangements were in place. While we had listed these pieces as participation requirements in our testing invitations, we had no way to predict if users fully met the technical criteria or whether there would be issues the day of. While we ultimately didn't encounter any technical problems, it was important that we had a communication plan in place so that we could reschedule any participants experiencing these issues. On the facilitation side, we had to completely reconsider how to approach human interaction when communicating through a screen rather than face-to-face in a shared room. It was important that we try to recreate the traditional testing experience as closely as possible, however, and we relied heavily on best practice guidelines from the Nielsen-Norman group to help us plan for our sessions. On the one hand, virtual testing made it incredibly easy for note-taking members of our team to fade into the background by muting their mics and turning their cameras off, which helped minimize distractions and allowed participants to focus on the tasks at hand. This was a great benefit over our in-person testing, where a note-taker was also physically present in the room and could serve as a possible source of stress for participants. So, despite assurances, someone sitting and watching you while silently taking notes is bound to feel uncomfortable at best. The main downside from the observation side, though, was that users' small camera size and fixed front-facing position did make it slightly harder to read body language cues that would be more pronounced in person. Delivering tasks to participants followed the same overall structure, where the facilitator would read each task out loud, one task at a time, and then provide a written copy to participants. Previously, we used printed paper slips to provide a participant copy. However, here we relied on the Teams chat to copy-paste prompts. This sounded good in theory, however, we did encounter two issues. The first was that tasks did not copy-paste well from our Word document into Teams, as copied text defaulted to a dark font with poor contrast and had to be manually edited by the facilitator each time before sending. Secondly, users would have to toggle between the website and the Teams window if they needed to reread the prompt, which could create disruptions to cognitive flow that in-person testing would not have had. One final challenge we experienced was how to approach note-taking. In the past, each observer would collect their own physical notes that would be entered into a shared document at a later date. We opted to try a shared note-taking document this time around to hopefully A, skip the need to re-enter data a second time, and B, co-locate notes around shared topics, usability problems, and so on. In practice, however, the testing team found the document to be somewhat crowded and confusing, and it was easy to get lost on which section to be in across several separate usability sessions. In future, we'd like to try a separate note-taking document again to see if this works better for our team's flow.
So those were some specifics we had to navigate in the pivoting process. And now we'd like to share some major lessons learned. One of the biggest takeaways was the importance of staying organized as a facilitator. We found that it's a lot easier to get disorientated when working with multiple documents at a time on a single screen and making sure we're reading directions and copying and pasting the correct prompts from the correct section of our documentation. As well, with two note takers, in hindsight, it might have been advantageous to designate one of the note takers to be an observer of body language. As a note taker, I was so busy scribing what the participants said that I didn't pay attention to observing nonverbal indicators of frustration or confusion. Our next steps are to now decide whether to continue with remote testing for future usability tests now that we're mostly back to in-person operations at our campus. While this will likely fall on a project-by-project basis, future testing around the Makerspace website will likely remain virtual so that we can have better comparability between multiple phases of testing and offer more flexibility for user and moderator testing schedules. We'd also like to explore potential tools for unmoderated remote usability testing that could allow for completely asynchronous sessions at whatever time is convenient to participants. Sidecar learning is one such tool that was recently utilized by the UX team at the University of Arizona Libraries. The University of Toronto Libraries currently uses sidecar learning in the context of asynchronous information literacy instruction, where a side panel provides instructions, images, and quizzes to users that they can follow along with at their own pace in a parallel browser window. With some tweaks, this could hold great potential for testing and making improvements to our digital spaces. And that concludes our presentation on pivoting to remote moderated usability testing. As promised, we have a link here to a Google folder containing our slides and usability testing materials. We've also provided our contact information if you'd like to touch base with us at any point down the road. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time, and at this point, we'll open up the floor to any questions.
So thank you to Sarah, Elizabeth, and Adriana. Obviously a very topical, timely subject to be looking at. And ideally with a lot of care and consideration as you've taken, get the results that you're looking for. So we have a question here. How did you recruit remote users for the tests?
Great, thank you so much for the question. So I might answer this in collaboration with Elizabeth. We did have a group, a pool of students all ready to pull from. Elizabeth, are you able to respond to that?
Yeah, so our Makerspace users are a pretty tight community. So I sent out the request through our email listserv and got a fair number of responses back. So that was easy in some ways, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And another question, did you find that remote testing drew different demographics of students?
That's an interesting question. And I would add to that, kind of bouncing off what Elizabeth said, is that in this case, we were drawing from kind of an existing pool, whereas in the past when we did in-person testing, that was a lot more broader in terms of our recruitment. So we were going through signage in the library, we were recruiting online. So there's a bit of a broader scope, but in the end, we do end up pre-screening all our participants to make sure they're kind of hitting on our target users. So in the end, we're still kind of matching what we're hoping to test and the users that make sense for what we're testing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would just add that our Makerspace community is pretty diverse, and I think that was reflected in the people who were tested. People who had lots of familiarity with the Makerspace, but some who didn't. A breakdown of years within the campus, as well as gender and discipline. We had a good diverse group.
Excellent, thank you. One more question. Were there any insights that you discovered while doing remote testing that you had not expected?
I was actually expecting more things to go wrong than they did, but I think this is part of our lessons learned, was really just the importance of staying organized. So we had this big, huge list of documentation to really be step by step, but we did find it overwhelming at times, and it was really just important to make sure you weren't getting lost in that. So at one point I had read aloud a task to a participant, but what I ended up copy pasting was a completely different task. So that really just illustrated, make sure you're not getting lost, and maybe in this case having one big document with everything there was detrimental. Maybe I could have broken that up. So I had my facilitation script and then my list of tasks separately. That might have made it less confusing or prevented me from getting disoriented. I don't know if anyone else from the team has other insights they could offer.
Yeah, for me, I thought, am I unmuted? Yes. Yeah, I thought working from the one document was a little bit, we had mentioned in the slides that maybe we were too busy. I was trying to figure out what Elizabeth was going to write and who was going to write that comment, and I didn't want to overlap anything, and I think it was mentioned that we missed watching the student. So that was the big takeaway for me. I don't have a lot of UX experience, but I liked I liked it remote. But yeah, maybe just separate observation documents, and then we'll just compare and contrast later.
Absolutely, you can expect the unexpected maybe. So another question, did you read the questions to the users during the test or only pasted the questions in the chat? Could it affect the comprehension of the tasks by the users?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I began by reading the prompt aloud to them, and then I copy pasted it into the chat so that they would have a copy. When we did in-person testing in the past, it would be the same thing. I would read it and then give them a slip of paper. So that way they would have something to refer back to if they weren't able to remember or they wanted to double check what something said. Something I might be interested in trying in the future, though, is having the participant read the prompt out loud rather than me, and then they can kind of work through it at their own pace as well. I'm not sure if there's any best practices usability testing wise around which might be preferred, but either way, we would want to make sure there's some sort of verbal reading either by myself or the participant, and then they'd have a physical copy they could refer to in text.